Sumerian tablets are probably one of the oldest form of a written record that we have. What we're looking at here is a Sumerian tablet that actually shows the tree of life, flanked by divine beings. You can see here the Anunnaki on each side. Before I die, you must know this. Those were the words attributed to Samuel Noah Kramer, the man who translated more Sumerian texts than any human in history. For over 50 years, Kramer sat alone with clay tablets no one else on Earth could read. Tablets older than the Bible, older than Egypt, older than recorded history itself. The Sumerians didn't just invent writing, they invented kingship, law, cities, timekeeping, and the very idea of civilization. But buried inside those cracked tablets was something far more unsettling. Kramer noticed patterns, stories that didn't evolve, warnings that repeated with mechanical precision, and descriptions of gods that behaved less like myths and more like administrators, beings who issued commands, measured humans, punished failure, and spoke of humanity as something engineered. Near the end of his life, Kramer became increasingly disturbed by one conclusion he rarely stated publicly. The Sumerians were not writing legends. They were recording instructions, events, and interventions they believed were real. And if Kramer was right, then civilization didn't begin with human brilliance. It began with contact. And the tablets were never meant to be poetry. They were meant to be remembered. Before we show you the part Kramer hesitated to publish, hit like and subscribe. This is where the story changes. The sentence that wouldn't let go. Holding a tablet that was written thousands of years ago and being able to read what it says. It's an amazing thing. For decades, Samuel Noah Kramer had read thousands of Sumerian tablets, lists of grain deliveries, temple hymns, royal decrees, and creation myths. Each line seemed to belong neatly to its category until he began noticing something that refused to fit. Certain phrases kept appearing where they had no reason to be. A ceremonial line meant for temple ritual would reappear in a warehouse record. A phrase from a hymn to a god would turn up in a worker's ration list. They were fragments that refused to stay silent, echoes that followed him from one translation to the next. At first, Kramer dismissed them as coincidences or habits of scribes. But as the repetitions grew, so did his unease. These weren't random slips of the stylus. The same patterns, numbers, symbols, and formulaic sentences appeared across entirely different genres of text. He started calling them the sentences that wouldn't let go. They crossed the boundaries between sacred and practical writing, between myth and mathematics. To most scholars, this overlap meant nothing. It was simply the product of shared vocabulary. To Kramer, it was a clue to something deeper, a design hidden inside the world's first writing system. He began tracing these phrases across archives from different cities, Uruks repeating. One phrase in particular haunted him, to raise the pure mountain and bind heaven and earth. It appeared in temple hymns describing offerings to the gods. But the exact same line was also found in construction logs for the ziggurat of Uyu. Why would a builder's record repeat the language of a sacred chant? Why would the act of laying bricks be described in cosmic terms? The more Kramer looked, the more connections emerged. Lines that opened prayers also opened accounting tablets. Blessing formulas matched the phrases used to seal trade agreements. Numbers considered divine, 3, 7, 60, appeared not only in myths, but in supply tallies and ration schedules. He realized that the Sumerians were not merely using writing to record their world, they were using it to align their world. The same words that invoked the gods also defined labor, trade, and governance. This discovery unsettled him because it meant that writing in Sumer was not neutral. It wasn't just a tool for memory, it was a structure for thought. By embedding sacred language in the ordinary, the Sumerians blurred the line between worship and administration. Every tablet, whether it listed sacrifices or taxes, reinforced the same worldview that divine order and human order were one and the same. Kramer began to wonder if the Sumerians had designed this overlap intentionally. Perhaps their scribes, trained within temple schools, learned to weave mythic language into bureaucratic records on purpose. If so, every document they produced was more than data. It was devotion disguised as routine. He suspected this was no accident of culture, but a conscious system, a civilization, teaching itself how to think through repetition and rhythm. By the time Kramer wrote his later works, he could no longer ignore the evidence. These sentences, the ones that refused to let go, formed the backbone of an entire ideology encoded in clay. They made the act of administration itself a sacred duty, transforming writing into both a practical tool and a spiritual exercise. To read a Sumerian tablet was to glimpse how language could hold a civilization together. Little did Kramer know those stray phrases would soon point him beyond words to a message written not on tablets, but into the stones of the ziggurat itself. The ziggurat as a three-dimensional text. When Samuel Noah Kramer turned his attention from the tablets to the towering ruins of the ziggurat at Ur, he began to suspect that the Sumerians had not merely written their worldview, they had built it. Rising from the flat Mesopotamian plain like a man-made mountain, the great ziggurat of Ur stood as both temple and symbol. Its massive terraces climbed toward the heavens, culminating in a shrine dedicated to the moon god Nana. Every brick, every step, and every alignment with the stars seemed to carry the same message Kramer had been uncovering in clay, the fusion of heaven, earth, and authority. What fascinated Kramer was how the written and the built mirrored each other. In the temple archives at Ur, he found endless lists of materials, baskets of clay, measurements of bricks, and offerings of grain. At first glance, these were ordinary administrative records, but their phrasing was uncanny. Lines from hymns appeared in construction logs. The same ritual verbs, to purify, to ascend, to bind heaven, were used to describe both religious ceremonies and the hauling of building materials. To Kramer, this could not be a coincidence. The language used to build the temple was itself sacred. Every act of construction was written as a continuation of creation. He began calling the ziggurat a three-dimensional text, a monument that could be read as well as climbed. Each terrace, he noted, represented a level of the cosmos described in Sumerian myths. The lowest terrace symbolized the earthly plane, the middle levels, the atmosphere and stars, and the highest the divine realm. Worshippers ascending the stairways were not merely walking upward. They were moving through layers of theology. Kramer realized that the ziggurat was not only an architectural wonder, it was the physical expression of the same patterns he found hidden in the tablets. The priests, scribes, and laborers who built it were, knowingly or not, enacting the words inscribed in clay. The deeper Kramer studied, the clearer the parallels became. In one set of tablets, offerings to Nana were listed in rhythmic, formulaic lines, each mirroring the measured structure of the ziggurat's terraces. In another, the king's role was described as the stair between gods and men, the living embodiment of the ziggurat itself. These phrases weren't poetic flourishes. They were blueprints. The building was both a symbol and a script, where architecture, religion, and politics spoke the same language. Kramer's growing conviction was that the Sumerians had achieved something extraordinary. They had turned their architecture into an extension of their writing system. The ziggurat and the tablets did not simply coexist. They completed each other. One made belief visible, the other made it repeatable. Together, they created a cycle in which every festival, offering, and law reaffirmed the cosmic hierarchy etched into the city's skyline. This realization transformed Kramer's understanding of Sumerian civilization. He began to see the ziggurat not as a building that hosted religion, but as religion itself, a living, breathing doctrine of stone. The structure's geometry and its surrounding archives formed a single message, that the order of the world was fixed, layered, and divine. Every ascent up its stairways mirrored the human desire to rise toward understanding, but it also reminded every citizen of their place within that order. For Kramer, this was the key to his growing theory. The Sumerians didn't separate sacred and secular life because they couldn't. The very language they wrote and the buildings they erected made sure of it. Their civilization was a text you could walk through, a theology you could touch. But Kramer's deeper revelation came when he looked at the scribes themselves, the gatekeepers of this living system, the scribes who ruled through words. As Samuel Noah Kramer followed the trail of repeating phrases from temple walls to ziggurat terraces, one truth became impossible to ignore. Behind every sacred hymn, every royal decree, and every ledger of bricks stood the scribes. They were the hidden architects of Sumerian civilization, the ones who transformed thought into record and record into law. While kings built monuments and priests led rituals, the scribes were the quiet engineers of continuity. Without them, there would be no civilization to remember. In the great tablet houses of cities like Ur and Nippur, young scribes trained for years under strict supervision. They copied lexical lists, hymns, contracts, and myths until they could carve cuneiform signs from memory. Kramer noted that these schools were unlike any others in the ancient world. They didn't separate the sacred from the administrative. A student could spend 1 hour practicing the dimensions of a brick shipment and the next reciting a hymn to Inanna. Over time, these parallel disciplines blurred, producing a mindset where writing itself was a ritual act. Each stylus stroke was both documentation and devotion. Cuneiform, with its thousands of wedge-shaped signs, was not an easy script to master. Many symbols carried multiple meanings, depending on context and pronunciation. A sign for star could also mean God, and the symbol for life could double as a count. Kramer realized that this flexibility gave scribes enormous interpretive power. They could encode theology inside economics, embed myth into trade records, or lace divine order through administrative texts, all without changing a single mark. In other words, they didn't just record power, they wrote it into existence. The scribes' control of language made them indispensable to both temple and throne. Every law, hymn, and transaction passed through their hands. To the public, they were servants of the gods and the king. In practice, they were the system's nervous system, deciding which words endured. Kramer was struck by how their training bound them to secrecy and hierarchy. Knowledge of writing was limited, guarded, and inherited through a few elite families. Literacy was power, and power was piety. A scribe's quill was as sacred as a priest's staff. In his research, Kramer compared scribal formulas across centuries and found a continuity that defied dynastic change. Even when kings fell and cities burned, the phrases persisted. The same openings, closings, and ritual numbers. To him, this endurance revealed that it wasn't the rulers who shaped the civilization's identity, but the scribes who maintained the code. They were the custodians of cosmic order, ensuring that each new reign spoke the same divine language. Theirs was a quiet dominion, enforced not by armies, but by words impressed into clay. This discovery reframed Kramer's understanding of the Sumerians entirely. The ziggurat might have embodied their theology, but the scribes were its interpreters, those who could translate between gods and men, myth and math. Every inscription, from creation myths to ration lists, bore its invisible fingerprints. They decided which ideas were preserved, which phrases were repeated, and which truths were canonized. To Kramer, that made them the first true authors of ideology in human history. Still, one mystery remained. Why did so many myths and ledgers repeat the same numbers, symbols, and phrases, the pattern hidden in the clay? By the final decade of his life, Samuel Noah Kramer had read more Sumerian tablets than any living scholar. But instead of satisfaction, he felt a gnawing sense of incompletion, an intuition that the real message was still buried beneath the obvious. The words were clear, the grammar stable, yet something about the repetition of forms, numbers, and phrases seemed too deliberate to dismiss as convention. There was a pattern in the clay, one that stretched across centuries, city-states, and kings. It linked myths to ledgers, prayers to tax rolls, and cosmic hierarchies to human ones. In his notes, Kramer began charting these recurring sequences like a mathematician mapping constellations. He noticed that certain words appeared together in predictable cycles: pure, measured, binding, ascending. The same triad surfaced in temple hymns, festival decrees, and even scribal exercises. At first it looked like standard ritual language, formulaic, symbolic, perhaps even poetic. But as he traced the combinations further, he realized they formed a structural rhythm, a template that governed how the Sumerians organized not only language but reality itself. The numbers told an even stranger story. Across hundreds of tablets, the same sacred figures, 3, 7, 12, 60, kept appearing everywhere. They showed up in myths, family lineages, temple offerings, even work logs. Samuel Noah Kramer began to realize this wasn't random. These numbers weren't just used for counting. They were a system. To the Sumerians, numbers weren't tools. They were principles of balance. They believed the universe itself ran on these patterns, and daily life had to match that cosmic rhythm. So when a priest offered 7 sheep or a builder recorded 60 bricks, it wasn't simple accounting. It was symbolic, a way of keeping the city in sync with the universe. Math wasn't neutral. It was ritual. What unsettled Kramer most was how this structure never changed. Different kings, different cities, different centuries. Yet the wording, the formats, the logic stayed the same. Whether the ruler was Ur-Nammu or Shulgi, whether the tablet came from Uruk or Lagash, it all followed the same hidden template. It was as if every scribe was copying from an invisible master script. Religion, bureaucracy, and mythology all ran on the same underlying code. That realization pushed Kramer toward a radical conclusion. The Sumerians weren't just using writing to describe their world. They were using it to keep that world running. Writing didn't record order. It created it. Inscribing laws, rituals, and hierarchies into clay was how those things became real and permanent. Kramer began calling this system the Sumerian Code. Not a secret cipher, but a cultural program that endlessly repeated itself. The ziggurat was its physical symbol. The tablet was its tool. The scribe was the operator. Each reinforced the other. Reading a text meant participating in the system. Writing one meant renewing it. These tablets weren't passive records. They were machines that kept civilization going. Kramer later admitted to a colleague that this idea disturbed him more than any myth or artifact he'd ever studied. It suggested that the world's first writing system might also have been the world's first programming language, a way to encode belief, hierarchy, and obedience directly into society. If that was true, then the Sumerians hadn't just invented literacy. They had invented something far more powerful: ideological engineering. The patterns in the clay weren't messages about gods. They were messages about control. As his health declined, Kramer began hinting more openly at what he believed. "Before I die, please listen," he wrote. In his final years, he spoke less in polished lectures and more in fragments, unfinished thought that sounded half like insight, half like warning. His students remembered him as careful and understated, never dramatic. That's why it was so striking when he began ending letters and interviews with that same line. It wasn't a plea for attention. It was the voice of someone carrying a truth he felt had gone unheard. Kramer's conclusion hadn't come from a single tablet or translation. It emerged slowly after decades of study. The Sumerians, he believed, were the first people to truly understand that language doesn't just describe reality. It shapes it. Their words were performative. When a scribe wrote that a king ruled by divine will, that statement didn't just report belief. It created belief. Writing itself became an act of creation, and whoever controlled it controlled reality. In his later notebooks, Kramer wrote that every civilization is built on two kinds of power. One is visible: bricks, armies, temples. The other is invisible: stories, laws, myths. The Sumerians fused the two through writing. The ziggurat made hierarchy visible in stone. Cuneiform preserved it in text. Together, they formed a loop that trained generations to see order as natural and unquestionable. The priest read the tablet. The laborer laid the bricks. Both believed they were serving the gods. In reality, they were following a logic written centuries earlier by scribes long gone. Kramer worried this idea would sound mystical or conspiratorial, so he rarely stated it outright. But in one letter, he wrote a single sentence and underlined it twice. The Sumerians discovered that to rule the mind, one needs only rule the symbols. To him, this was their greatest invention: control through language instead of force. A quiet power that would become the foundation of every organized society that followed. The tragedy, Kramer believed, was that this power became invisible precisely because it worked so well. Once writing was woven into religion and government, no one questioned it. Sacred words became state law. The Sumerians didn't just create a script. They created a system of thought that would echo through legal codes, religions, and bureaucracies for thousands of years. Where modern readers see ancient texts, Kramer saw the blueprint of civilization itself. His final, unpublished writings read more like reflections than academic work. He argued that the line between myth and record, sacred and secular, didn't exist at the beginning. The first writers didn't document truth. They manufactured it. And to Kramer, that wasn't an accusation. It was an acknowledgement. Humanity's first great technology was belief, made permanent through words. Myths weren't mistakes. They were tools, frameworks that helped humans organize, remember, and imagine. Seen this way, every tablet, scroll, or inscription wasn't just a record of the past, but a design for the future. In the end, Kramer's warning feels more relevant than ever. The Sumerians taught humanity a dangerous lesson. Whoever controls writing controls truth. Their clay tablets didn't just record a civilization, they created one. Through words, they shaped faith, power, and order. So the question remains, are our institutions still using language the same way? If this made you think differently, like and subscribe, and join us in the next deep dive into the ancient secrets still shaping the modern world.